First, it is essential to clarify one key point. Reverse Hoover is not an emotional act, nor is it an expression of love or remorse. It emerges precisely at the moment when the narcissist realizes that a direct return has become too dangerous. At this stage, they understand very clearly that if they initiate contact and are rejected by you, their ego would suffer a direct injury. Therefore, instead of approaching you openly, they choose an indirect path that minimizes risk while still serving their need for control. The mechanism of reverse Hoover is built on a very simple principle: creating enough disturbance to force you to react. Rather than speaking to you directly, they influence the environment around you through rumors, half-truths, selective smearing, or staged situations such as crises, illnesses, or sudden incidents. The objective is not the content of the information itself, but your emotional reflex. The moment you send a message, ask a question, or feel compelled to explain yourself, they obtain what they need. Proof that you are still within their sphere of influence. At this stage, the narcissist does not need you to fully return. They only need confirmation that you are still psychologically pulled into their orbit. This allows them to maintain two things at once: a sense of internal control and a favorable external image in the eyes of others. If you are the one who initiates contact, they can easily reshape the narrative to their advantage, avoid accountability, and continue protecting the persona they rely on to function. The problem begins when this core assumption no longer holds. If you do not argue back, do not justify yourself, do not grow curious, and do not fluctuate emotionally, the narcissist enters a state of collapse. Every emotional bait falls into a void, and their familiar operating system begins to lose orientation. From that point on, their subsequent reactions are no longer controlled manipulations, but a series of escalating psychological responses that unfold in clearly defined stages. This video is not intended to guide you toward confrontation or toward proving anything to the narcissist. Its focus is on illuminating what actually happens inside them when you no longer serve as the emotional regulator they once depended on. When you withdraw from that system, their power does not disappear because you have become stronger, but because the foundation that allowed that power to exist is no longer there. And from this moment onward, the entire psychological process behind the narcissist's behavior begins to reveal itself according to a logic that, once understood, will prevent you from confusing their panic with what is often misinterpreted as change. Stage 1. Misreading. They think you are only temporarily silent. In the first stage, after reverse Hoover begins, the narcissist completely misreads your state. They do not see your silence as a genuine withdrawal, but as a familiar reaction within an old script. In their frame of reference, silence is never an ending. It is merely an intermediate step before emotions return. As a result, they believe you are playing hard to get, creating distance to gain leverage, or waiting for them to make the next move. This belief stems from a deeply rooted assumption in the narcissistic structure. All relationships operate on conditions. In their understanding, no one remains silent without still expecting something. Therefore, your silence is interpreted as a form of emotional control rather than emotional release. They believe you still have feelings, you are simply suppressing them, and that those feelings will eventually surface. Because of this misreading, reverse Hoover at this stage is not aggressive or panicked. It takes the form of a test. They release subtle signals, vague stories, indirect messages, just enough to knock on your emotional door. The goal is not to pull you back immediately, but to check whether you still react. If you respond, even minimally, their belief is instantly reinforced. You are still there. At this point, the narcissist does not yet feel that their power is threatened. They still believe they are controlling the tempo, that you are merely pausing within a game they know well. This confidence is precisely why they do not escalate, do not reveal themselves openly, and do not change strategy. In their eyes, everything is unfolding exactly as predicted. The core error of this stage lies here. They assume all silence is conditional. They cannot conceive of the possibility that your silence is not about waiting, but about leaving, not about manipulation, but about self-preservation, not about maintaining position, but because you no longer wish to play. This misunderstanding lays the foundation for the entire chain of psychological reactions that follows, because when they continue acting on a false assumption, each subsequent move pushes them further away from a reality they are not yet prepared to face. Stage 2. The moment reverse. Hoover loses effectiveness, and the illusion of control begins to crack. The turning point appears when they begin to notice something fundamentally different. Those signals no longer produce any movement in you. It is not that you are trying to appear strong, rather, the familiar inner reflex is no longer occurring. You do not feel the need to explain, to correct the narrative, or to prove yourself as the reasonable one. At this point, the narcissist is not merely being ignored. They begin to lose the ability to locate you within their psychological system. For a narcissistic structure, this is a serious problem. Their entire understanding of relationships is based on each person around them occupying a specific role: mirror, regulator, emotional container. When reverse Hoover fails to generate a response, your role becomes blurred and then gradually disappears. They no longer know where to place you. Not an object to control, not an object to blame, not an object to manipulate. This indeterminacy creates a form of instability they are not equipped to manage. At this stage, many people mistakenly assume the narcissist is calming down or giving up. In reality, the opposite is true. Internally, they are experiencing a cognitive rupture. What once worked no longer works, yet no new framework has formed to replace it. This is when the illusion of control begins to fracture, not through a dramatic shock, but through the accumulation of repeated small failures. The direct consequence is a shift in how they interpret the situation. Instead of believing you are silent because you still have feelings, they begin to confront a far more uncomfortable possibility. You may have genuinely withdrawn from the system. This does not only threaten the relationship, it threatens their self-concept. Because if you are no longer affected, then the power they believe to be natural is revealed to exist only through your participation. From here, reverse Hoover transforms from a tool of control into a failed test. Each signal they send without receiving a response no longer reinforces their ego. Instead, it exposes their dependence on external reaction. Whether they are consciously aware of it or not, a truth has begun to take shape. Their power does not lie in the actions they generate, but in whether you still participate. When that participation ends, the entire structure behind reverse Hoover begins to destabilize, opening the way for the next psychological stages they can no longer control in the old way. Stage 3. Cognitive dissonance. When the system falls out of sync, when every escalating attempt still produces no reaction, the narcissist enters a highly specific state they rarely acknowledge: psychological disorientation. This is not immediate panic, but a quiet misalignment between what they believe and what is actually happening. Throughout their lived experience, emotional manipulation has always produced results. So when reverse Hoover loses its effect, they have no place for this phenomenon within their familiar psychological map. At this stage, they begin to experience cognitive dissonance, a conflict in perception. On one hand, they still believe you have feelings, that you are still affected, still there. On the other hand, reality consistently contradicts that belief. No response, no confusion, no indirect signals, no emotional fluctuation. These two cannot both be true, and internal tension begins to build. Yet instead of accepting the possibility that you have genuinely withdrawn from the system, they tend to search for alternative explanations to protect the ego. This is why, at this stage, you often see contradictory and inconsistent behavior. At times, they appear indifferent, as if nothing matters. At other times, they overreact, speaking or acting in unusual ways. This is not because they are changing, but because they are trying to recalibrate reality to fit their old beliefs. Many narcissists begin to self-soothe with internal narratives such as, "They'll react eventually," "They're just trying to look strong," or "No one lets go that easily." The defining feature of this stage is that your role in their mind becomes ambiguous. You are no longer an object to control, yet not fully accepted as gone. This ambiguity creates an intolerable gap, because the narcissistic system does not function well with the undefined. They need to categorize people: who is usable, who must be discarded, who is an enemy. When you do not react, you do not fit cleanly into any category. This is also the point at which they begin checking themselves through others. They may talk more about you within their environment, not necessarily to smear, but to probe reactions, to see which version of the story aligns best with what is happening. These accounts are often inconsistent, shifting with context, reflecting internal confusion rather than a clear strategy. What the narcissist does not yet realize at this stage is that your lack of reaction is not merely disrupting a tactic, it is dismantling the operational logic they rely on. They begin to sense that something has slipped beyond their control, but not clearly enough to name it. This ambiguity prevents them from stopping, yet also prevents them from moving forward decisively. It lays the groundwork for the next stage, when the loss of your role is no longer a suspicion, but something felt directly. Stage 4. Role loss realization. When they realize you have withdrawn from the role, this stage does not begin with a dramatic shock, but with a slow, heavy realization. The narcissist gradually understands that you no longer occupy your former role. Not because you resisted, not because you were angry, but because the psychological function you once performed has disappeared. In the narcissistic structure, people exist as functional components: mirror, regulator, emotional container, bearer of inner chaos. As reverse Hoover fails repeatedly, they are forced to face the truth that you are no longer fulfilling any of these functions. You no longer mirror them, regulate them, carry emotions for them, or help them maintain the sense that they still have impact. This is a highly dangerous moment for the narcissistic psyche, because it is not built to survive without the functions provided by others. They do not possess a sufficiently stable self to self-regulate. When you fully withdraw, the void does not appear only in the relationship, it appears inside their internal structure. They begin to feel clearly that a part of their psychological life has stopped functioning, yet they have no way to replace or repair it from within. At this stage, you may see very strange reactions, unusual silence, or conversely, chaotic and inconsistent behavior. This is not because they are awakening, but because their familiar system has lost a supporting pillar. Your absence means they can no longer test themselves through you, no longer confirm their value by affecting your emotions. This is the moment when role loss becomes tangible. The key point of this stage is this. For the first time, the narcissist can no longer read you. You are no longer a predictable, manipulable, or exploitable object. This shatters the sense of omnipotence they once relied on to operate within relationships. They begin to feel a form of anxiety far deeper than rejection, because rejection still keeps you within the relational field, while role withdrawal removes you from their psychological map altogether. From here, reverse Hoover is no longer merely a tool of control. It becomes evidence that the old system no longer works. The narcissist may not yet have language for this, but they begin to feel an uncomfortable truth. You have not only left, you have ceased to exist as a psychological anchor. And this realization opens the next stage, where anxiety is no longer contained, but transforms into control panic. Stage 5. Control panic. When control collapses. When the narcissist realizes that you have truly withdrawn from the psychological role that once kept their system running, they enter an entirely different state: control panic. This is no longer experimentation, confusion, or tactical adjustment. This is the moment they clearly feel that their familiar power no longer functions as it once did, yet they lack an internal structure strong enough to self-soothe. What is lost here is not only you, but the ability to regulate emotions through others, the core survival mechanism of narcissistic psychology. In this state, reverse Hoover ceases to be a cold, calculated strategy and becomes a survival reflex. They may swing rapidly between opposing behaviors: grandiosity, victimhood, emotional coldness, or uncontrolled rage. These expressions are not aimed at pulling you back directly, but at desperately recreating the sensation that they still have an impact on the external world. When you do not react, they are forced to seek other outlets for the instability rising within. It is crucial to understand this is narcissistic injury at a structural level, not an ordinary emotional wound. In earlier stages, they could still self-soothe by believing you had feelings, that the right timing or tactic would eventually provoke a response. At this stage, reality is unmistakable. You are no longer part of their system. And without you to reflect them, the persona they rely on to stand before the world begins to destabilize. The most common consequence is behavioral escalation toward those around them. New supply is treated more harshly, family members are drawn into conflict, children or the workplace become dumping grounds for inner chaos. This is not because you did anything wrong, but because when they lost you, they lost their emotional regulator, and all internal pressure begins spilling outward. This is why many people later hear that after you disappeared, the narcissist became worse, not better. At this stage, you may also become a powerful trigger symbol in their mind. Hearing your name, seeing you live peacefully, or knowing you are no longer affected, can be enough to reactivate feelings of helplessness and shame they cannot process. But instead of facing those emotions, they typically convert them into anger, blame, or destructive behavior. This is not longing. It is the reaction of an ego that cannot tolerate the loss of control. The central truth of this stage is simple. You do not need to do anything. Their panic does not come from your actions, but from your irreversible absence within their psychological world. When you no longer participate, their system is forced to operate on its own, and it is precisely then that the real limits of narcissistic psychology are exposed. This stage opens the path to what follows, an attempt to reconstruct self-image, not in order to change, but simply to survive the collapse they cannot acknowledge. Stage 6, adaptive persona, when they put on an evolved mask. After control panic fails to produce the desired outcome, the narcissist moves into a more refined phase, restructuring the persona in order to adapt. This is the stage that most easily misleads outsiders, and sometimes even you. On the surface, they begin to change. Their tone softens. Their behavior appears calmer, and signs that resemble self-awareness or emotional maturity may emerge. But this shift does not arise from shadow integration or genuine inner accountability. It comes from the need to stabilize their self-image after a loss of power. At this stage, the narcissist no longer tries to trigger emotions directly. Instead, they adopt a strategy of inducing doubt. They present themselves as a version that is different, has understood, or has let go, not to return to the relationship, but to make you question yourself. Were you too rigid? Did you misread them? Could things have been different? This is an advanced form of reverse Hoover, one that does not rely on crisis or smearing, but on reactivating the image of the potential person you once believed in. The critical point to see clearly is this. This new persona lacks a corresponding inner foundation. It does not include the capacity to tolerate shame, genuine recognition of wrongdoing, or responsibility for the harm caused. It is a shell constructed to cover an inner void, not the result of real change. The narcissist is attempting to re-establish external stability in order to avoid confronting internal collapse. At this stage, many people return not because they still love the narcissist, but because uncertainty has been activated. When you see them appear composed and seemingly no longer needing you, a part of you may be pulled into self-doubt. Was your silence excessive? Did you misunderstand their motives? This doubt is the true target of stage 6. If you break your withdrawal just to check, they will immediately read that as confirmation that their influence has not fully disappeared. However, if you maintain distance, the limits of this adaptive persona soon become evident. Without feedback from you, it has nothing to anchor to. The narcissist may sustain this image in front of others, but internally, the emptiness remains unfilled. This leads to a crucial shift. You are no longer an accessible target, but a fixed psychological reference, a marker of power that has been lost. This stage marks the final boundary between the possibility of pulling you back and the acceptance that you have truly exited the equation. The persona may continue to exist, but it is no longer oriented toward you. From here, the relationship is no longer an active loop, but an unprocessed memory in the narcissist's mind, opening the way to the next stage, where you are no longer a player, but an untouchable symbol. Stage 7, symbolic fixation. When you become an untouchable symbol, this stage begins when the narcissist is forced to accept a reality they were never prepared to face. You are no longer an accessible object, not because you are hiding, but because all familiar pathways to reach you emotionally no longer function. When the adaptive persona of the previous stage fails, you exit the sphere of direct action and move into an entirely different position in their mind, the position of a symbol. At this stage, the narcissist no longer attempts contact, nor do they deploy overt strategies to pull you back. Instead, you exist in their psyche as a fixed point representing the loss of power. You are no longer perceived as a concrete person with emotions and choices, but as a marker that defines the limits of their control. As a result, they cannot let you go in the usual way, yet they also cannot approach you as before. Externally, this stage is often very subtle. They may refer to you indirectly, obliquely, or observe from a distance in silence. Not because they miss you in a healthy sense, but because your symbolic presence activates an unresolved inner conflict. You represent the question they do not want to answer. How could someone who was once within their control leave without leaving an emotional trace? At a deeper level, you become living evidence of their imperfection, not because you did something wrong, but because you did not do what they expected. React. Your calm exposes a void in the narcissistic structure, where power was once maintained through emotional impact on others. Without that impact, they cannot close the psychological loop. This creates a form of psychological fixation. They cannot fully move forward, yet they cannot return. You become a symbol of unacknowledged failure, an unprocessed memory, a fixed anchor preventing the restoration of omnipotence. This is why, at this stage, even though you are no longer directly involved, they may still be triggered simply by knowing that you are living peacefully, stably, and without needing them. Stage 7 marks the final transformation of your position, from a manipulable object to an inviolable symbol. You no longer exist within their behavioral cycle, yet you remain as a boundary they cannot cross. And here, the relationship ends not through conflict or reconciliation, but through absolute psychological separation, setting the stage for the final phase, in which the narcissist must choose between fleeing reality or reconstructing their entire identity to continue surviving. Stage 8. Exit strategy. Withdrawal or identity reconstruction to survive. Once you have become an untouchable symbol, The narcissist enters the final phase of the process, exiting reality through a survival strategy. This is not healthy acceptance, but an ego-based survival decision. They understand, without ever stating it, that you are out of the equation, and that any attempt to pull you back would only further expose their limitations. From this point forward, the focus is no longer on you, but on how they avoid confronting the inner void. This stage typically splits into two distinct paths. The first is chaotic withdrawal, escalation of destruction in their current environment, changing relationships, jobs, locations, or abruptly cutting contact. The goal is to escape any context that might remind them of the helplessness they have just experienced. This disappearance is not healing. It is an attempt to flee from primal shame they lack the tools to process. The second path is identity reconstruction. The narcissist builds a new persona, often alongside a new environment and new relationships, to serve as a stage. They may appear as a completely different person, more successful, more moral, more spiritual, or more victimized. But what all reconstructed identities share is this: you are not included, not because they have let go, but because your presence is tied to the memory of lost power, something the new persona cannot tolerate. At this stage, many people mistakenly believe the narcissist has moved on or changed. In reality, they have only changed stages to avoid facing the truth. There is no inner integration, no accountability for the harm caused, and no capacity to look directly at their own role. Their silence is not peace. It is a deliberate form of numbness. The most important truth of stage 8 is this: reverse Hoover is completely dead, not because they no longer want it, but because every path back to you requires touching a shame they cannot process. You have become a psychological limit they cannot cross. Whether they withdraw or reconstruct identity, that choice confirms one thing: the old system cannot be restored without your participation. At this point, you do not need to monitor, decode, or wait for any clear closure. The ending already occurred earlier, at the moment you withdrew from the role of emotional regulation. Stage 8 is merely the inevitable aftermath. The narcissist continues living by avoiding reality, while you move onto a different trajectory where they no longer have access. And that is the true end of reverse Hoover, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. By the end of this journey, what matters most is no longer how the narcissist escalated, which strategies they tested, or whether they ultimately chose withdrawal or identity reconstruction. All of that is merely consequence. The true center lies in a very quiet yet decisive shift. You are no longer inside their psychological system. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop proving, and stop participating, reverse Hoover is not defeated. It simply has no ground left on which to exist. What the narcissist cannot tolerate is not that you leave, but that you leave without carrying emotional charge. Your calm is not cold indifference. It is the sign that you have returned to them the emotional responsibility they once placed on you. And when there is no one left to carry it, the narcissistic structure is forced to expose its own limits, not through dramatic collapse, but through increasingly fragmented, contradictory, and powerless reactions. If there is one lesson that runs through this entire process, it is this: psychological power does not come from controlling others, but from the ability to withdraw without losing oneself. You do not need to win. You do not need recognition, and you do not need an apology to close the door. Your non-participation is already the final answer, not for them, but for yourself. And at this ending point, the relationship does not conclude through revenge or reconciliation, but through something the narcissist was never prepared to face: irrelevance. When you step out of the old role, their system collapses according to its own internal logic, and you, perhaps for the first time in a long while, no longer need to react in order to survive. You simply continue living within a psychological space they can no longer reach.